This is Tired Goth, and you are watching the Academia Gothica computer show. So today's episode is actually going to be a pretty important one to me. I'm going to be talking with you about routers, but not just any routers. We're going to be talking about the difference between routers and falsified routers, or routers that are meant to take your data and reroute it to sources that aren't inherently or intrinsically connected to any information sources or internet provisions that are legitimate. For example, there are some routers that are built to take your information and funnel it to a secondary source before it gets back to the ISP as a genuine interaction or a genuine exchange of information and data. The way that this happens is if you run into an actor or a threat actor who happens to know where you live, has your information, your credentials, things that would point to you being a legitimate person, and they have a secondary agenda in addition to what it is that they're already doing. Perhaps they work for a legitimate company and they simply don't have legitimate intentions. What would then happen is you might end up with faulty hardware inside of your house and not know how to detect it. So I am going to point out to you the different ways that you can tell whether or not your router has integrity, whether or not it has integrity to do what it is that it's meant to do for your internet service provision and to keep you safe. So one such example of this is learning about something called a Wi-Fi pineapple, or alternatively, if it's not going by that specific name, since that is a trademarked name through the Hack5 group, who create amazing hardware. I mean, for a red team software and hardware provision that they have built, they are one of the leading sales groups for, I guess you could say, hardware and tech that is meant to infiltrate certain systems and get a closer look at people's authorizations, credentials, and things without the authorization. Now, why are these tools important since they sound dangerous, right? They're important because if you are learning about how threats work, this hardware is crucial to understanding how these things work, who uses them, what they can do, and how they can infiltrate your information, or rather your sense of security more so. So the way that I like to pose this is that it's not the hardware that's necessarily the problem. It's definitely the types of groups who gravitate toward using this hardware for their own intentions. It is always the intention behind the use of something. So while you as a researcher could use this hardware to do your own research as to how powerful it is not always necessarily used for a nefarious purpose, and therefore I do defend the hardware, not the criminal. But let's carry on to how you can tell the difference between hardware that could be used for nefarious purposes that way and something that is standard during an installation. The way that these things are introduced is the Wi-Fi pineapple looks like a router. It looks like a regular router. It would be difficult to tell apart unless you knew what to look for. Typically, on a falsified router, which is meant to take your data and feed it to a third party before it actually gets to the phone service or ISP service that is giving you that information, um, in the way of your services, your internet subscription, anything like that. In this case, it would be an internet service provider. If someone installed a faulty um, router or anything on your phone, it may actually be more difficult to detect. And the reason why is because it would be encased inside of your phone, and it would be difficult to track that unless you pulled your phone open. But for this episode, we're going to be talking about the standalone routers that get installed when you call a phone company or the internet company and say, I would like to rent a router for a monthly internet service. A Wi-Fi pineapple, or I'm not gonna use that example, but a falsified router versus the example that is native to, I guess, the internet that you're using is going to have a few extra parts. It may have a few extra stickers on it. It may not have hardware that is typical to your internet use. It may have extra antennas on it. So instead of a standard router, which is usually just a flat round box, most of their models are pretty uniform the way that they look. There are no extra signal collection units on it. And when I say signal collection units, it is usually an antenna or two of them side by side, which are used to pick up signals, which would be sending information to the router to collect information back without authorization, meaning that data, unfortunately, could be stolen this way because there are interceptions allowed through those antennas and through those connection points that are built onto the router itself. And there's also sometimes a software plugged into the router's chips that activates and allows for an automatic reception to an attacker. So you have a situation then where the hardware itself is welcoming the attacker because it is pre-programmed to accept those attack pings to check on the router's stability, connection to the internet, and things that would allow it to be, using information that is connected then to someone else's owned machine and feed it elsewhere. There are sometimes host servers also statically connected to these routers where the server itself is a connection point and a ping service that checks how the router is collecting information and then feeds that information back again to the attacker through a hosted network and a hosted service. It's sort of like a remote access thing, but it's programmed to assure that any information that's traveling through the router also goes to a malicious server and gives all of that information to the attacker to inspect, to collect, decrypt, whatever it is they're choosing to do with it, so that they can continue to gain information on you without you knowing that that's happening. And that is the really scary part about having a router that is installed in your home and you don't know the nature of its structure, its build, or anything that it could be doing as it's built, as it is used, the way it was built, I should say. So a standard router is going to be very plain. It's not going to have any panic-based instructions on it, like plug it in right away. The minute you get this, plug it into the wall. It's not going to have stickers like that on it. But a fake router might. A fake router might have some very interesting language written on it in the form of instruction stickers. It might also have what is called a falsified, if you check on the back of it, a falsified serial number or product number. And the way that you can tell these apart is the product number is going to be sort of like, I want to say like a patent identifier or an identifier for the chipsets used in it, the hardware model and make, its release information, its firmware version information. For those of you who don't know what firmware versions are sort of like a traceable type of identifier that you can trace through hardware and software to see what updates have been added to it, what versions it's running, and what version it would be responding to as a corresponding piece for a device, or also specifically the internet service that it would be receiving to then send to your home. So it's all about pickups. It's all about what the chip is able to pick up in the way of a signal, which signal version they would be using, which signal type they would be using, and all these types of things that would allow you to have stable internet and the type of internet you would also be receiving, the speed, the integrity of the internet, the security of the internet connection itself. All of these things are able to be traced technically through the basic firmware provision and the information there that you would have, because even if it's slightly different or slightly changed, you would have an idea of what the transmission was supposed to look like in its natural state. And when I say transmission, it's the transmission of the internet service from the ISP or the internet service provider to your home and all of the provisions therein. So fake routers in general are going to look a little fancier. They're going to look a little newfangled. They're going to look like they have a few extra parts that are attached to them. The antennas are one thing. The box itself is going to be a little larger. It will look sort of like it's able to pick up more information than your average basic router. And another thing about it is, if you're going to encounter one of these routers, you may also get the feeling that there's just something off about it. It'll come with extra parts, extra plugs, extra things that you can plug in around the house. But most internet service companies are actually a little frugal with the parts that they send you. They don't go overboard with connection, I guess you could say, port plugs and things that you can use, like Cat5 cables, things like that. They don't really overdo it with that. They send you as many as you might need, maybe two, and they're like, okay, that's fine. You know, you don't have like a secondary plug and an extension to plug into and things to include in that to house the cables themselves. Usually it's a plug and play straight into your wall, and there's not all of this extra stuff attached to it. So when you start getting things like that, and like, you know, encasings for your cables and things to plug into the wall and create or generate a more viable signal, or a more viable information detection uh, service, which could be embedded into the pins themselves at that point, you get the idea that maybe the malicious wares are all being plugged into the many ports of your home and will continue to collect information whether or not you're hooked up to that router anymore. For example, if you happen to have one of those extension casings, which is like a beige kind of housing in plastic with these pins inside of it that would be connecting to the Cat5 cable connection, that it's like a gray cable that would plug into your router, you would technically still have an in for a data collection service to be plugged into your wall if you used it, say, for a regular phone line, or another service that could be provided through a different company, or if you move out and someone else moves in and plugs their stuff into that, they would still technically be under investigation. It could be a very long-standing kind of thing if you don't know what hardware to detect in your home and unplug it so that it can't keep feeding external sources that are trying to make their way into your home for data collection. So it's it's an interesting thing to pay attention to. It's definitely an interesting thing to realize can be introduced to your circumstances if you're not careful. So I just wanted to do a quick show about that. This is Tired Goth. This is the computer show. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. My information's on the Patreon right at the top of the page. And I'd be happy to hear from you. If you like my content and you like what I do, feel free to subscribe. Paid subscriptions also get you multiple copies and different formats of my first book in my series, the Actually series. The first book is called Privacy Actually, and more books are on the way as well. So stay tuned for that. I'm very excited to announce that that's coming along very well. And in addition to this, you can also check out my merch store. I have a merch store where all of the graphic designs are based on memes and hacker situations that I myself designed. If you scroll to page 2, some of the seasoned hackers may actually get a real kick out of that. uh, I'm not going to say too much, but if you know, you know, it's great. In addition to this, you also have the option to check out some of my other works. If you are familiar with the Onion layer hosting thing, I also have a LokiNet page that you can poke around on from the LokiNet self-hosted Onion services. Not sure if they're still around, but this is something I had been plunking around with some years ago prior to making the Patreon the more active source of this stuff, because I had actually been going underground for a while to see if I could start hosting my own websites there. But as you know, cost effectiveness lent me to come back to Patreon and gather you all to my content to listen and watch at will. And if you're interested, subscribe at will as well. So just know that your support really is helping me, and I intend to help you as well. I love you guys, and I'm grateful for your support. I'm grateful for your attention, and I'm grateful to be here doing this for you. I love you. Catch you guys later. Have fun. Bye.